Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me again on Flight Station. On today's video, we're going to walk through what is required in order to be successful on your PPL, Private Pilot License flight test in Canada. Given that the PPL flight test was my first ever flight test that I've ever encountered, I was quite nervous. So what I've done is I'm creating this video to help you pass yours. I'll go through some aspects of the flight test that you can prep for beforehand. So what I've done is I've come up with my top 5 things that can help you pass the PPL flight test. So the first thing I want to recommend to you is the flight test guide. Transport Canada pretty much gives you a freebie with this guide. It has everything that you are expected to know for the flight test, and anything on the flight test guide is fair game. So the best part about it is the fact that before you even go into the test, you know for each of the exercises. For example, let's look at steep turns. What is expected of you? What you will be expected to do? Your limitations, and any other details pertaining to passing that exercise, and how you'll be graded, etc., etc. It's a very useful tool, and I recommend that you go through the flight test guide at least a couple of times before your flight test. Now, if there was ever a book that I would recommend for your flight test, it would be the Flight Test Notebook. Now, this book is good for your PPL and CPL flight test, and my instructor introduced me to this book. It's published by the same publisher that wrote From the Ground Up, and that is why I would highly recommend this book and stand behind the book. Now, why is it useful? Because it gives you a complete guide on what to expect on your PPL and CPL flight test. Because this video is about your private pilot license flight test, I'm recommending this book for that test in particular. The book's price is not, it really is not that expensive. I've seen people out there selling it used, so pick up a used copy if you can, and trust me, you will not regret it. One of the things you're going to want to do is take your aircraft's checklist. Now, this checklist can be issued by your flight school or your instructor. Take that checklist, and since you cannot take it home with you, what I did was I created my own copy of that checklist. And it did not contain any amendments to the checklist that the school had. What I simply did was I took all the pages of the checklist, I resized it to a format that worked for me, and I put it into this small binder. And as you can see, every single item on this checklist is exactly according to what the school's checklist had. And how this helped is because I was able to now take this checklist anywhere I went and study all of the contents of the checklist. As you can see, this is a checklist for the Piper Aztec that I used for both my multi-engine training and also my IFR training. And the cool part about this is the fact that you can use it in the aircraft as well, and you can carry it around and study the checklist wherever you go. As you can see, I've also incorporated the emergency checklist as part of this, and also the aircraft speeds that I need as a reference. I also have the climb performance, the cruise performance right off of the aircraft's POH as well. The takeoff distance, accelerate, stop distance, etc. Now, if you fly a Piper aircraft, you will notice that Piper likes to publish these charts that are used for range versus density calculation, or your single engine ceiling calculation, true airspeed calculation, density altitude calculation, for example. Also your stall speed versus angle of attack, etc., etc. What I did was I had these checklists put into a binder with these pages within these glossy paper, this format of paper. And what that allowed me to do was I could simply draw out all the lines right on this paper and simply wipe it off after I was done for reuse. So that really helped in my training and also during my flight test, because when the examiner asked me, how did you get these values or how did you get these numbers, I simply referred to my own aircraft checklist and I said, look, I used these charts and I was able to determine what the numbers were. Now, it is kind of, I guess, time consuming to get this going, but as you can see, everything that you may need for your aircraft can be put into a nice binder that you can use or reuse in the future. Now, this is something that I developed over time. So as I was doing my flight tests, I realized that I needed some sort of organized way to tackle each flight test. So what I came up with, and this was not something my instructor told me to do, it was just something that I learned, I would say probably in university, getting organized for the test itself. I know that it takes a fair bit of work to do this, similar to a few other things I've done to prep for the flight test, but I promise you, you will not regret doing this. So let's get started. The first one is this flight test application binder that I want you to create. Now in this binder, I'm not going to open it up, but in this binder what I have is, for example, I have the receipt for the Transport Canada licensing fee that I paid. I will also have things like the application that you need to fill out and provide to your instructor before you're admitted for the flight test. I believe you give it to the examiner, not your instructor. The third thing that you will need in this folder is the recommendation letter, for example, from your instructor that you provide to your examiner that he is recommending you for the flight test. So everything that you need to apply for, or to be eligible to do the test goes in this folder. The second folder, I call this the flight test guide. I don't know if you can see it, but the flight test guide, pardon my bad writing. What I did in that folder is I created a checklist for myself, and that checklist contains what documents I need for the test, what are the things I need to know, so critical speeds, what I need to be prepped with for the flight test, so the weight and balance, with the charts for the aircraft, CFG. Now, I believe this was specifically for my multi-engine, which is why it doesn't have a few things that are related to the PPL, but this was for my multi-engine test. And I also have a flight test checklist from a flight test book called the Flight Test Notes. And I use their checklist because their checklist also contains the documents for the aircraft, records of experience for your logbook, and then the flight test guide that you need to read, letter of recommendation, etc., etc. So I created this flight test guide so that let's say, for example, my flight test is in a couple of days and I know it's coming up, I start going through my checklist to see what I need to get done. And also as part of this binder, because if it was just a checklist, then it would be pretty light. It would be 2 pages, right? So what I do is I collect all the forms that I need to fill out for that flight test and keep a copy of those forms in this folder. But I never use those copies. Why? Because I make copies of those documents as I'm prepping for the flight test, and this stays as an original. So for example, I know that I'm going to be doing a weight and balance for my multi-engine or IFR flight, Group 1 IFR. So this document is the performance document for the multi-engine aircraft that I fly. So I put that in here so that I know that on the day of my flight test, this is one of the things I'm going to need, and it's also part of my checklist. If I go forward here, there are pre-flight calculation sheets. I also have, what else do I have? Oh, okay. So I've got this weather checklist as well. So NOTAMs, SIGMETs, AirMets. I don't know if you can see it, but let me just zoom in there. So SIGMETs and AirMets, and then Pyreps, Mitar, Satellite, ASEP is a product that I use a lot from NAV Canada. GFAs, departure minima, alternate minima, etc., etc. So these are things that I was getting ready for the IFR flight test, and that was my checklist for it. Now, knowledge, what do I need to know for the test? Aim, cap, departure minimums, communication failure, etc., etc. So a lot of the things that I need to know for the test are part of these checklists that I've come up with. And then finally, all the performance numbers, I put them in this document as well, but I never take them out, or I never use this document to do the calculations. This is just my master document as a guide for the flight test. Now finally, my last folder is called the actual flight test folder, as you can see it up here. Again, sorry for my writing. And in this document is where I use the copies from my flight test guide to do all my calculations and actually crunch my numbers. And this is what I will be presenting to my examiner. And pardon me, I don't have all this filled out because I didn't use all of it. But whatever I used, I took it out of this binder and provided it to the examiner. So this folder is always going to be used for the actual flight test. Last but not least, understanding the documents for your aircraft. So understanding what each entry in the registration document means, the insurance of the aircraft, document of airworthiness, entries in the journey log. So what I would recommend is just going through these docs even before each of your flight training flights, not just in preparation for your flight test, so that you have a very good handle of all the documents that relate to the aircraft that you're flying. Because like I said, because as you can see, this is part of the Transport Canada flight test guide, so any of this is fair game on the exam if the examiner should ask you about it. I hope this has been helpful information, and thanks again for joining me on Flight Station.